Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Why Compliance Needs Innovation. I'm Lois Engstrand, the marketing manager here at CloseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague, David Noble, who's going to moderate an excellent panel of industry experts. But before I hand it over to David to introduce everyone, let's just quickly run through some key items. This webinar is live. That means you will all have the opportunity to ask the panelists a question. You can do that by typing it in on the right-hand side of the screen, where you see it says "Say Something." You will then choose a couple of questions that we will ask the panelists during the Q&A, which is in about 30 minutes time. This webinar is being recorded. That means you will all receive an email later with a link to the recording so you can rewatch it, or you can share it with a colleague or a friend. I'm really looking forward to listening into this discussion, so let's get going. I hope you all will enjoy. And David, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
You're on mute, David.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much, guys. So as Lois was saying, we've got a great panel lined up today. Thanks to everyone that's listening in. Just to quickly introduce everybody, we have Natasha Vernier from Fintrail, previously head of financial crime at Monzo. Sophia Bantanidis from Citi, head of regulatory strategy and policy. And then David Cowland from Fidelity International, head of compliance operations. So today we're going to discuss the innovation within compliance. We're going to ponder why compliance needs innovation. As we know, compliance has undergone a number of transformations over the years, not least in response to waves of regulation following the 2008 crash. Obviously, we hear that a lot. The term RegTech has come to define the disrupting startup or scale-up, as most of these tech firms are now. Many of these firms have been created by bankers, lawyers, risk and compliance professionals, many frustrated by the lack of innovation and the lack of effective and efficient processes that they saw in their own organizations. So enormous resources, billions of dollars, all have been put into developing technology solutions that really are intended not just to keep up with regulatory changes, but also to remove or change ineffective compliance and governance processes that really can create a lot of wasted or missed opportunities, ultimately making the job of compliance harder and costlier than it needs to be. So despite the best efforts of the innovators and the trailblazers, a survey by Accenture reveals that whilst investment in compliance operations is rising, compliance has in many cases not taken advantage of the tools and technologies that are available, and so the opportunity for improvement might be being missed. In contrast to that, we can point to organisations like Citi, Fidelity, like Schroders, Barclays, ING, Monzo, of course, organisations that have built innovation into the core of their businesses, which not only enables them to provide better customer experiences, more efficient business processes and better effective compliance processes, but it's enabled them to react quickly to change. And as we've seen, obviously most recently with the COVID pandemic response. So let's start at the beginning. David Cowland, if I can kick things off with you, what does innovation in compliance look like in your organisation?
Well, I think on one level, sorry, apologies, someone was trying to dial me. On one level, it can be as simple as using technology to replace sort of manual spreadsheet-based approaches. But on a more complex level, I think it's about transforming compliance into a partner with the business, where compliance is saying yes to initiatives as long as we can monitor and ensure regulatory compliance. So kind of in summary, it's about a kind of proactive, forward-thinking, technology-driven approach to supporting the firm's business strategy.
So technology really being kind of core to that process then, is it? And that ability to kind of move forward?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So Sophia, is that something you would agree with? I mean, how does compliance look like in Citi?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I really like what David mentioned about being a partner with the business and I'll give a little bit of a long-winded answer, but it's just based on my personal professional experience, because I don't work in compliance now at Citi. I work in the Innovation Lab. Compliance is one of my partners, but I have worked in compliance at 3 different institutions: Barclays Global Investors, and Northern Trust. And I worked at the regulator in the UK and France. So I saw firsthand what needed improving and where progress needed to be made. And the common theme I saw across all of these institutions in compliance, so the real big pain point, was communicating advice to the business. I mean, compliance communicating regulatory advice to the business. They need to do it quickly. They need to do it consistently, even when they have to make a judgment call. And particularly when they have to go back to the business and say, no, the answer no, don't do it like this, but this is what you can do in order to comply. And communication is really key, because it is the backbone of the relationship that compliance has with the business. And it is one of the key ingredients you need to understand the business so that compliance can actually fulfill its role. And as a practical example, my first ever job in compliance was working for Barclays Global Investors, where I was responsible for reviewing and signing off all financial promotional activity across the region. And the rules here that we had to adhere to are very subjective. The marketing material has to be fair, clear, and not misleading. So compliance needs to make a judgment call. So the innovation here, and what we have seen lately, is that through the use of technology, we can actually record and code decisions that we have made in the past, particularly when a judgment call needs to be made, when we need to judge whether a promotional material is or isn't fair, clear, not misleading, so that we make consistent decisions going forward, and to link the compliance advice with the underlying rule and policy and procedures that we have in place. Technology and regulatory technology can help us do all of these things, and there are very interesting RegTech firms that have emerged to help us with this pain point. So this is an example of an innovation in compliance. It's not breakthrough innovation, it's more of an operational improvement, but nonetheless very important. And if you flip to the other side of the fence, after Barclays Global Investors, I actually went to work for the financial promotions team at the regulator in the UK. At the time, it was the Financial Services Authority. And of course, if you fast forward a few years, what's happened is that specific team, the financial promotions team, now uses technology, supervisory technology, the other side of RegTech, to trawl through all the different promotional materials that firms are putting out there, so that in a more automated way, it can filter which ones are not fair, clear, and not misleading. So, they employ a combination of web scraping and text mining to audit financial advice documents, promotional documents that are disseminated by firms. And we have seen regulators in other countries, in Australia, the securities regulator, and in the Czech Republic, use, again, similar technologies in that promotional space. So those are just some practical examples and a long-winded answer to your question in terms of innovation in compliance at regulated institutions, but also at regulators.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. I certainly don't think it's long-winded. I think that's something that we hear and a lot here at Clause Match. Really, it's about ensuring that the advice being communicated by compliance is consistent, it's in line with precedent, and ultimately, it's that if you're going to deliver a no, there needs to be a but. You want to be able to help the business there. So, Natasha, your experience, I guess, from being in that role as head of financial crime for a new bank, and also in the role you're in today, where clearly you're in a very innovative role, working with clients around the world. How do you see innovation, and what's your view, I guess, from both of those sides?
Yeah, so I've seen innovation from a very different perspective to both Sophia and David, and it is much more from the point of view of how can these new companies really compete in an industry that is hundreds of years old. And to stand out, these new fintechs, they do have to innovate in order to make it possible to work more cheaply, to be able to survive with less funding, to be able to actually offer slightly different products. And so at FinTrail, which is a financial crime consultancy, we see a lot of fintechs who fintechs are under a lot of pressure, a lot from the press, but also from regulators, to sort of prove that they are being compliant, especially in the financial crime space. And so there are lots of conversations going on between FinTrail and our clients around sort of how can we help them use technology to really prove that, that they are being compliant. When I was at Monzo, I was very lucky because the entire company was really about, the whole purpose of Monzo really was to sort of innovate on banking, innovate in regards to what a bank actually is. And so we really took a first principles approach to that. We looked at the regulation and we really tried to understand what did we have to do, and then how could we do it in a completely new, completely innovative way that had not been done before, that might make it easier for customers and give customers a really great experience, also cheaper for us, and also more effective. How could we use new techniques, perhaps techniques that hadn't been used before, to try and stop more crime? So I think it's very different when you talk about sort of what innovation means, when you talk about it from the point of view of a fintech, as opposed to the point of view of a more established company like Citi.
And so in that role at Monzo, with such emphasis on innovation, then the relationship between what, from a risk and compliance perspective was being done was very close to the customer, essentially. So it was really enabler there for better customer experience in order to ensure there was a better functions throughout the bank, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So at Monzo, we had our financial crime team was in the first line of defense. So the team that I led, we were building things like the transaction monitoring systems. We were in charge of all of the onboarding processes. So we were able to really come at all of those really difficult problems with a really fresh perspective and with the freedom to build our own solutions. And our risk and compliance team in the second line of defense, they also were able to go out and try and source, different ways to approach the risk assessment. There was nobody sitting there saying, risk assessments are all done in most banks using this tool in this way, therefore we must do it that way. We were given the freedom and the space to try to work out what made most sense so that we were compliant, but could also make it easier for everybody to understand what was going on, and to make it easier perhaps for us to share information with the regulators and so on.
So that's really interesting then. So Sophie, just bringing this back to you then. So in terms of innovation, what do you tend to see comes first? Does the compliance organisation come along with a defined set of requirements and objectives, or are you pitching to them on better ways of working?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is it's both. But I would take your question one step further and ask, what do we think is driving this innovation? Is this change demand-led, meaning is it coming from the needs of the institutions like Fidelity, like Citi, like Barclays? Or is this demand and innovation, is it change-driven? Is it driven by the startups like ClauseMatch, for example? And that's very interesting. And again, my answer to this would be, it's a bit of both. There's definitely demand from the institutions like ourselves, and this demand is always on the back of a pain point, an internal compliance pain point and a client pain point. It's on the back of inefficiencies. And also on the other side, we have seen many startups like ClauseMatch, for example, that were set up, or their founders came from banks where they saw the pain points and they saw the problems and they came up with clever ways of fixing them, and they formed a regulatory technology firm. And perhaps if I can give a practical example of the first point, where the innovation is driven from the institution, whether that's compliance at Citi or the innovation lab at Citi, or our sales team at Citi. Last year, the Innovation Lab, where I work, celebrated its 10-year anniversary. And we did that by putting out a big pitch to progress challenge for the industry, actually for the RegTechs and FinTechs. And we focused on a specific area, creating the future of client services together, and how do we deliver a better client experience? So that's quite a broad theme, which we split up into different use cases and pain points that we have. And we said to the startup community, we said, look, pitch to us, help us solve these very specific use cases. We selected the top 10 startups and they pitched to us at our event in Dublin last year. Clause Match was there pitching specifically on a regulatory technology use case, which I'll tell you quickly because I think it highlights the point. And it's to do with regulatory change and regulatory developments. So we are a highly regulated firm. Our clients that we service also represent highly regulated industries, and they are very risk averse. When it comes to regulation, it is a shared pain point between ourselves and our highly regulated clients. And often, as a result of regulatory change or an emerging regulation, particularly in the field of payments and currencies, and remember, I represent the transaction banking business, we need our client to take certain action so that we can keep servicing them, so that we can keep processing transactions for them. So the challenge for us is how do we communicate regulatory change timely, super timely, and in multiple different languages to our clients so our clients can take the necessary action. And here we saw some very interesting pitches from the different startups, including from Clause Match. So this is an example where the innovation is demand-led from the institution. But like I said, it comes from both sides.
Yeah, that's excellent. And so David, how do things look in your organisation, in Fidelity International? I mean, where are you positioned within the compliance organisation, and is it a case of are you taking ideas to them, or are they bringing requirements to you?
So obviously working within compliance, part of my job is to sort of facilitate that change. I think a lot of it also depends on mindset and how open individuals are to change. So to Sophia's point, it comes from both sides. I'm clearly there pushing new ways of working, new technologies, trying to drive those efficiencies. And throughout the teams, you get different sort of levels of people who want to see change. So I think it comes down to that kind of mindset and how open people are to changing the way that they do things. But you've got to remember that compliance teams are often very busy. Yeah, they're kind of the gatekeepers of all that regulatory knowledge that's coming through. And all those regulatory changes that are coming through, and you're monitoring, you're advising, so you are busy on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the areas we've seen sort of real positive change is where I sometimes think that when you look at compliance teams, they're often the last ones to know sometimes, right? The business want to drive revenue streams, they want to change the way they do things. Do they always include compliance at the start? Maybe not. Mm-hmm. So we've had some examples where one product that we rolled out, I think people realized the need to bring compliance in right at the beginning, and a senior individual was placed within the project team right at the start. So as the technologists and the business teams working hand in glove in a very agile way to develop the product, the compliance lead was there to offer advice to stop the product being tripped up by regulatory needs. So that's a kind of very positive way of trying to bring compliance in at the beginning, rather than 6 months down the line saying, we're ready to go, can you sign this off? And compliance says, well, hold on, we've got some compliance issues here. So bringing compliance in at the beginning, I think, is that important piece that we are trying to do. And importantly, innovating the compliance team so it doesn't have to do any of the manual lift. You get machines to do the heavy lift, get the compliance officers where they need to be, which is the analysis, their kind of background, their knowledge, to opine on that regulatory need so that things can move forward far faster for the business.
So if we kind of just staying around that subject at the moment, if we think about areas for improvement or opportunities for improvement, and obviously in our world we look very much at regulatory change and policy management side of things. So when it comes to managing these things, regulatory change and policy change, is there opportunity? Do you see room for improvement in the ways in which those processes are managed and how employees ultimately are communicated with when these changes go ahead?
Yeah, definitely. In compliance, where we are ultimately responsible for communicating the regulatory changes and the impact assessment of those changes to the business. I think over the years, there's been an increase in regulation. I think they said sometimes like over 200 items get reported every day. And so that increase in regulatory change across jurisdictions has led to an increase in workload for the compliance teams, where potentially you could do it with spreadsheets and you could log it with individuals. People could understand the changes, but critically now that the breadth of change that affects your organisation across every jurisdiction. We're in 26 countries, so that's a lot of change for us. The ability to store it centrally, triage it, workflow it to the right SME, undertake the assessment, and then importantly being able to communicate it to the business. So I think that's where, and we're actually running I'm running a program of work to automate that process, because it is and has been very manual. But I think in the reg tech space, the solutions now exist to stitch together the entire regulatory landscape. So that, again, goes back to that point I said, the machines start doing the heavy lift, right? They start bringing the data in, we start storing it, we filter it, we feed it through to the right people, so that compliance officers turn around and say, I'm not spending 90% of my time trying to get to the data and then 10% analysing it. We do it the other way around. They spend a majority of their time analysing the impact, understanding how it affects the business, and then communicating with the business and saying, hey, look at this change. We probably need to start looking at this quickly, because it's going to have an impact on the way that we are trying to do our business today.
And Natasha, from your perspective then, so obviously policies and procedures around financial crime are obviously critical that these things are well communicated and kept up to date. So where do you see opportunities for improving there? Is it about speed of communication? Is it about accuracy? I mean, where do you think those improvements can come?
Yeah, I think this is where innovation in technology can play a really big part, actually. So I think especially at fintechs, there is a chance that the policies and procedures will be changing very quickly. And I think it's just a ludicrous proposition that you expect hundreds, maybe thousands of employees to remember the latest way that they're supposed to do something. And I think that this is where you could use technology to proceduralize the tooling and the internal systems that employees use. So if you take, for example, say the SAR regulation, if a change was brought about in the SAR regulation, where when you are reporting suspicion, you had to include a certain new bit of information, there is, near to a 0% chance that everybody filing SARs is going to remember every single time that they must now include that particular bit of information. But if you can use technology to automate that bit of information being included in the draft SAR, which then gets reviewed before it gets submitted, then you get around that whole problem of relying on human beings who are prone to forgetting things, and you end up with a much more secure system. I think this is actually, this was not prompted, but where clause match can play a really cool part, because you're already linking the regulation to the procedures and to sort of the risk assessment and the control log. But can you go one step further and link the regulation with your procedures with the actual controls and somehow work out how to proceduralize that in systems? I think that's a really, really big opportunity for fintechs to do themselves, but also for regtechs to come along and innovate in that space.
That's great, and that certainly wasn't prompted. No, so thanks for that. And there's certainly, yes, that is exactly what we're looking at the moment. And I guess nicely moving on from that, Sophia, then when it comes to having identified areas for improvement, technology, what's your evaluation criteria for assessing regtech solutions?
Yeah, that's a really good question, David. So, I mean, there are about a handful of criteria that we use. I'll highlight a few of those. But number one, we look at the value that the solution is adding to our clients. That could be internal clients and external clients as well, right? So the question here we're trying to ask when we're assessing the vendor is, does the solution address a client pain point? And you heard me talk about pain points earlier, but that's super, super important, because without any value add, then what's the point of adopting a solution? Number two, I guess it comes as no surprise to anybody, but we will look at how, what's the value proposition and the innovation capability. So here what we're trying to answer is, how innovative is the solution compared to current market offerings and compared to existing city products? How differentiated is this? And like I said, this comes as no surprise, because for those firms like ClauseMatch, I believe you guys were in the UK FCA's regulatory sandbox, right? This innovation criteria is what regulators are using as well when they're assessing regulatory sandbox applications. And then the next thing we're going to look at is, what's the maturity of the company that's pitching to us? How mature is it on the basis of its revenue, on the basis of its live clients? If it doesn't have any live clients, what kind of clients does it have in the pipeline? What partnerships does it have in place already with banks? What's its funding structure? We will look at the employees that the company employs and their strength. Are they only tech people, or do they actually employ people that understand regulation? What's the geographical coverage? In what countries can they support us? So that's all under the sort of maturity of the company bucket. Then we're also going to look at speed to market. Is the solution readily deployable? Could it be launched in a short time frame? Could it be tested quickly? We're also going to look at scalability. Is the solution scalable across market, across regions? We operate in so many different markets, hundreds of markets, and we employ 240,000 people. So we really need something that is scalable and not just narrow focus that we could use in one specific small area of the bank. And then, of course, we're going to look at integration and how feasible is it for us to integrate the solution. So here we will also look at the technology behind the solution, and can we actually integrate it? Because I think one of the things that some RegTech firms don't understand, often at the initial engagement, which might happen, at a conference in the coffee break of Money 2020, for example, they will show us a demo on their laptop and say, look, it's so easy and it's so easy to integrate. That is very different to actually integrating it in our environment. And we need something that is of industrial strength. And a lot of the solutions that we're seeing from RegTech firms, of course, they're cloud-based or SaaS-based, which is fine. We can work with those, but it will take us much longer to integrate because, of course, as you suspect, we have a very rigorous cloud risk assessment process, which not all RegTech firms pass. So in a nutshell, those are some of the things that we're going to look at when we assess RegTechs.
That's good. No, it's excellent. It's really useful to understand that process that an organisation kind of as large as Citi would go through. And I think, I think that phrase of industrial strength RegTech solution is something to bear in mind, definitely. So Natasha, I mean, from your perspective, then, from where you are today in FinTrail, I mean, how do you look at RegTechs? And I guess you're looking from the perspective of how you work with your client base around these. So does your evaluation criteria differ?
Yeah, I think in general, the fintechs will look at similar sort of things, ease of integration or all of those things. Something that I think is interesting for RegTechs to consider when talking to fintechs is really understanding the stage of the fintech and how much scrutiny they will be under by different parties. So for example, a brand new fintech with no customers looking for a RegTech solution to help them onboard customers. Initially, they really will mostly care about speed to market and the ease of customer experience. But if you move forward 2 or 3 years in that fintech's life cycle, and you're talking about a regulated fintech with millions of customers, the importance for them in that onboarding solution probably moves more towards how accurate is that onboarding solution at picking up fraud. So as well as all of those really great points that Sophia talked about, I think for RegTechs, it's really important to try to understand exactly where that specific fintech is in their life cycle to work out what will be most important for them right then and there, because it definitely does change. I saw that firsthand at Monzo.
And David, I mean, for the sorts of processes that you'll go through at Fidelity, I mean, did you see the same thing? Is it a similar kind of robust approach to evaluation?
Yeah, and you know what Natasha and Sophia have said, lots of points there that resonate, you know, especially around value proposition. Yeah, lots of stuff. I think for me, personally, it's about the problem. You know, I don't need a solution for a solution's sake, right? A great piece of kit, but actually doesn't answer anything that we need. So beyond that, I think, you know, with my technology background, it's increasingly whether the solution is moving towards a kind of machine learning, AI-based sort of solution. How is the RegTech company deploying that, or is it still rooted in, you know, an older kind of rules-based? Definitely in the cloud. We've got no interest of wanting to put it on-prem anymore. We want it in the cloud. It's SaaS. How is that set up? You know, who are they using as their kind of infrastructure or their platform? I think one of the things we are looking at, or I end up looking at, is the next set of problems. So we want to get off of spreadsheets. We are moving off of spreadsheets. Compliance faces a potential future problem where we have swapped our endless spreadsheets now for dozens of applications. And then users are going, okay, so I can't get all these applications open on my screen to do my work. So we've now created ourselves another problem, albeit the machines are doing a lot of heavy lift, but the compliance officer is saying, how do I get the information from application 1 through to application 12? So I think where we need to start thinking in terms of your RegTech strategies, yes, you want to move from spreadsheets to applications, but how do you move to a more holistic view? So how do you look at the user journey of your compliance officer? How do you make sure that they're not logging in, logging out, logging in, logging out between all the different applications? And I think that's where I need to solve the problem now, but I need to keep one eye on the future, that I don't end up with a dozen or more applications and then end up with another set of problems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Or worst, someone then creates a spreadsheet in order to manage data from all these different applications, and now you're back to the start.
Yeah, and the answer is often going to be, you know, it doesn't matter. You know, it's not like we're going to have one platform. Don't get me wrong. There is no one silver bullet out there to solve all of compliance's problems. But I think a more kind of holistic view of how things like, you know, comms and trade surveillance, how the regulatory landscape from Reg Horizon to obligations to policy, how those stitch together. And part of the answer is the ability to API between the different applications so that you're handing off data, triggers, you know, sort of regulatory change, triggers policy management, triggers control changes, those types of things. Okay.
Yeah. And Natasha, you talked about sort of automating more processes or processualizing activities around the business. So with that in mind, I mean, what kind of technology requirements do you expect to see kind of for the rest of this year and going into 2021? And I guess, you know, we can't ignore the backdrop of the COVID response and more people working from home now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that there will be any sort of regulatory requirements for new technology. I know that the FCA have tried to be careful not to specify how things should be done in that regard. But I think there will be a definite, maybe it's more of a hope, a move towards sort of outcomes-based approach rather than a risk-based approach. And I think as an industry, we are a little bit more concerned with ticking the compliance boxes than we are with actually stopping the crime. And I think there are some companies starting to think about effectiveness and outcomes. And certainly I'm looking at that within FinTrail right now. And if we can tell or help financial institutions really work out how effective they are, and if the regulators are very clear that their expectations are of improving outcomes, then I think we can move to a place where we're much better at actually stopping criminals and having the outcome improve rather than just ticking those compliance boxes. So in terms of what technology might be on the horizon, I really hope it's stuff around effectiveness and outcomes.
Okay. I mean, whilst we've been talking, we've had some questions coming in from people that are listening. I think we've got about 10 minutes now, so it might be a good point, I think, just to kind of maybe bring some of those in. And one of them actually, I think, ties in with what you're saying. So we've had a question: where does compliance technology overlap with business technology? And I wonder if that's, you know, where do we see that overlap between compliance needs and business needs kind of being met with technology? So, David, I don't know if you want to have a go answering that first.
So yeah, sometimes I suppose we get caught up with terms. It's all about running the business and, you know, generating revenue and making sure we're compliant. But I think in something like, you know, comms and trade surveillance, you talk about, you know, compliance technology, the need to monitor communications under MiFID or market abuse regulation. That's like, you know, definite need of compliance, versus say maybe the trade reporting element, which tends to go out from your business, the need to report under MiFID, make sure that your reports are going out based on the various types of assets and trades that you're doing. So I think there is where I kind of see that kind of overlap, the need from the business to meet the regulation, as well as the need of the compliance teams to monitor the teams that are undertaking those kind of tradings. So those platforms have a tendency or a need, I think, in the future to start coming together, because I think today you're kind of seeing investment management teams, right? We need to do this. We need to get our trade reporting out, ESMA, EMIR, MiFID. That's what we're going to do. With trading systems will sort of output the trade into a system that will then do the trade reporting. And then separately, compliance puts in systems to do trade surveillance, do comm surveillance. And I think increasingly we'll start seeing that crossover of platforms that say, isn't this all trades? Isn't it all comms? The front office are doing comms. We need to monitor comms. It all starts coming together. And so you'll start seeing those platforms come together to be able to cover a kind of holistic approach to communication and trade reporting and surveillance.
Okay, excellent. There's another one here. I wonder, Sophia, if you want to have a go at this one. So this really is to do with working with the IT department, I think, and you know, how important is it to have a close relationship with them when it comes to integrating solutions?
I mean, it's paramount. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere. And you know, in fact, at Citi, like, I mean, I'm not in the IT department, nor am I in the compliance department. I'm in the innovation lab department, which consists of IT people, our own IT people, and we work hand in arm with our central IT department that is responsible for our IT security and also for reviewing the IT of, you know, external vendors. It is, I mean, it's absolutely critical if you want to move forward, if you want to progress.
And critical too that you bring them, that you're working very early on in
absolutely
that. Well, yeah.
Absolutely. So just to give you an example here, internally I lead a group of what we call innovation ambassadors, and these are people actually in compliance, in legal, in risk, in tech, and in IT security. And very early on, I share with them the thinking and the work of the innovation lab, even when we're just working on an idea, before we even go to pilot something with a vendor, or even if we're building on our own, so that we have these people engaged and informed from the outset, up front, so that they don't come as an afterthought, because then we encounter real problems.
Absolutely, yeah, it makes sense. And Natasha, just to throw this over to you as well. I mean, could you see that maybe smaller financial institutions might benefit from bringing external parties in to help with that kind of initial IT planning phase?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. A lot of fintechs we're seeing have technology embedded in their compliance teams, financial crime teams, and so on. They're really coming with this approach of cross-functional teams. I think that is a really effective way to make sure that technology is embedded in absolutely everything that the company does. But you're absolutely right. As fintechs are trying to do things with less money, they're trying to compete really quickly, build up a big customer base quite quickly. It's often easier for them to buy in expertise, be that, you know, from regtechs or also technology expertise. So, you know, yeah, you can see a future where there is a company which is just about, you know, they are compliance technical specialists, and they get sent out to do compliance technology work at fintechs or financial institutions. You can see a future where that sort of expertise is pooled in companies. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We've got another interesting question here. So this is more about collaboration across the industry, and whether or not, I guess, financial institutions see compliance as a competitive issue or not. But given the losses in financial crime are huge, but shared across the industry, shouldn't there be a collaboration to find solutions, i.e. not make compliance a competitive issue? So I don't know, Natasha, again, if you want to start us off with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is totally absurd for any company to think that financial crime is a competitive issue. I will argue passionately about this with whoever wants to talk about it. I think it's just ridiculous. In the end, financial crime is about trying to stop criminals being able to move and use money that they've either gained illicitly or that they're using for things that we don't want them to be using it for, like financing terrorism. And the idea that, you know, me over here at my bank, I'm okay if I'm not financing terrorism, but I'm okay if you are. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So no, I think, yeah, everybody should be collaborating, and there is absolutely a future, I believe, where the fight against financial crime is entirely centralized.
And it's, and I think everyone would agree with your point. I think we've seen over the years lots of attempts for various banks in regions around the world to try and kind of come together and form almost utilities around some of these issues, but haven't quite been able to pull it off. I mean, Sophia, working in such large institutions as you have, I mean, do you see that there's scope really for more collaboration across the industry, not necessarily just for financial crime, but I mean across, you know, lots of areas that ultimately kind of come back to compliance for individual organizations?
Yeah, sure, because regulation is a shared pain point between, well, all regulated financial institutions, but also, like I mentioned, our clients as well. So to that end, yes, of course, there is further scope for collaboration. And it's actually very interesting to see that, you know, the organizations that regulate us are also bringing all these parties together. So the regulated firms like Fidelity, like Citibank, etc., the fintech firms, the regtech firms, the academics, the consultants, to work on solutions to common problems that we face as an industry, that we face in the world. Financial crime is one, but not the only example of this. So here particularly, I'm thinking of the various different tech sprints that have taken place over the last few years. You know, the UK regulator, the FCA, pioneered in this space. Last year, they did a big sprint on financial crime, actually, and looking at specifically privacy enhancing technologies and how that can help with data sharing, so that we can actually spot and catch the money launderers early on. So that's number one. But number two, more recently, I think it was a few weeks ago, we saw this go global. I don't know if you're aware, but the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, in combination with the Saudi presidency of the G20, what did they do? Guess what? They launched another tech sprint, bringing the industry together. And here they focused on, you know, 3 particular use cases, one on reporting, the other one on financial information sharing at times of pandemic, and the third use case, which just slips my mind at present. But point being, yes, there is scope, and we will be seeing more of this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we'll agree on that. And there's, as you say, lots of examples we can point to where we're starting to see that emerge now. Well, I think we're just about out of time there, and I think this has been a great session. I think, you know, in answer to, does compliance need innovation? I would say yes, it absolutely does, and I think we've touched on some of the reasons why today. But thank you to everyone on the panel for joining. It's been very good, and I hope everyone listening in has enjoyed it too. Lois, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. Both David, Natasha and Sophia, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and insight with us today. For all of you who are listening, I hope you did enjoy this discussion. We are running webinars regularly here at CloseMatch. You can go to closematch.com to check them out. Next one up is Compliance Moving Forward. That's going to be on the 24th of June, so in 2 weeks' time. Please make sure that you sign up for that one, and I hope to see you all there. Please do take care and have a nice